Dear colleagues, dear students, dear friends, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Aisha Chalar. I'm a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, IWM, in Vienna, and a professor at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at University of Vienna. And our team at the seminar series is composed of Clemens Schmidt, who is giving us a technical assistance, and Anna Chukovic, PhD student in anthropology, who is the coordinator of the seminar series. For those of you who are not familiar with our seminar series, let me give you just a kind of a brief introduction to that. Our seminar series on forced migration is part of Europe-Asia research platform on forced migration at the Institute for Human Sciences, IWM, and Mahanirban Calcutta Research Group. So it is anchored at these institutions, but it is also hosted at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Vienna. This Europe-Asia research platform on forced migration, it aims to advance the cooperation between European and South Asian institutions, academics, while working towards creating a joint research platform for innovative knowledge production on forced migration and bordering regimes. So by bringing together scholars, policymakers, and practitioners from different disciplines and regions, the seminar series aspires to decentering the scholarship on forced migration, scholarship, debates, and policies on forced migration. So it is part of a broader agenda of decentering knowledge production. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker today, I would like to remind you that the seminar is being recorded and we will have a question and answer session after the presentation. So please feel free to pose your questions in the chat portion of the webinar throughout the presentation. So we will read them afterwards during the discussion, and it might not be in the same order. Depending on the questions, it might be the case that the questions would be clustered, so that you know the rules beforehand. And in today's talk, we welcome Sabyasachi, Basu, Ray Chaudhury. He is a professor at the Department of Political Science and the Vice Chancellor at Rabindra Bharati University in Kolkata. And also he is the director of the Mahanirban Calcutta Research Group, which is actually where the series of seminar series on forced migration are anchored. Our research projects, collaborations are anchored together between IWM and the Calcutta Research Group. He is known for his work on international political theory, politics of globalization, democracy, refugee studies, and rights and justice in South Asia. If you are working in those areas, I think you're familiar with his work, his interventions. His publications include the Rohingya in South Asia, People Without a State, co-edited with Ranabir Samadar, and Indian Autonomies, Keywords and Key Text, again co-edited with Ranabir Samadar and Samir Kumar Das, which came out in 2005. All these names are quite familiar to the research platform, the Europe-Asia research platform on forced migration. There's another edited book which came in 2005, Internal Displacement in South Asia, the Relevance UN's Guiding Principles. This was also co-edited with Paula Banerjee, who was a speaker in February in our seminar series, and Samir Kumar Das. And there's another edited book, Sustainability of Rights After Globalization. This was also co-edited with Ishita Day. These are the few titles, and actually I could add there that we have a forthcoming edited volume together with Sabyasachi, Basu, Chaudhury, Ranavir Samadar, and myself on sites of statelessness. So you'll see that I'm not going to go down the list of Sabyasachi's publications, but he had widely published in various journals as well as magazines, newspapers, and he had appeared in various public platforms. So, dear Professor Chaudhury, thank you for accepting our invitation. We are very much looking forward to your talk, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Aisha Chalad, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my ideas and thoughts on the governance of forced migration in South Asia. And this is a wonderful platform, the Europe-Asia platform on forced migration. And I believe that, as you rightly said, that this is also an approach to decenter the knowledge production on migration and forced migration. Therefore, this is a wonderful opportunity for me. And to this evening's lecture, or this morning, afternoon, whichever way we look at it, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Today's lecture will be, as I said, on the governance of forced migration in South Asia, a need for a decolonial approach. I'll come to the decolonial approach later during my lecture. But first, let us take up the colonial legacy in South Asia. As we know, particularly the people more familiar with the South Asian politics, particularly the politics in the eastern part of South Asia, we know that the Indian borderlands both host and generate millions of refugees. And that was due to the partition, the decolonization. It was, simultaneously, it came with the partition of the Indian subcontinent. And in this context, we also have to remember that in these neoliberal times, which we cannot ignore, when the mobility of capital and mobility of technology, they have been deregulated during the last 40 odd years, 30, 40 years, migration, both voluntary as well as voluntary in the form of economic migration, or on the other hand, involuntary or forced migration, both have increasingly been shaped by national, regional, as well as global regulatory norms on the one hand, and also by the national and or regional security enhancing institutions. And this has been going on in a global order. I mean, both these things. I mean, the Indian borderlands generating refugees, receiving refugees, as well as this neoliberal world emerging. This has been going on in a global order, which was set up, which was established through the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And that facilitated, we know, a system of sovereign states to invent policies to rule within a particular specified territory. And this also managed to exclude other authorities from interfering into the domestic sphere. In Europe, if we look at Europe, the boundaries drawn around the territorial and sovereign states brought an end to the religious contestation, at least temporarily. But if we look at South Asia, the colonial remaking of boundaries, making and remaking both, in not only in South Asia, but also in Asia and Africa in general, in a way reignited ethnic and religious tensions. The long shadow, I would argue, of the Westphalian system has, in other words, been a curse in disguise for the post-colonial world, or the global South, as we call it today. So in this larger context, the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is the foundation of the international legal framework on forced migration, it was formulated to address primarily the highly disturbing refugee situation in Europe in the context of both the Jewish massacre during Hitler's time and the Second World War. However, these commendable steps, these commendable moves, largely ignored the unfolding situations in the erstwhile colonies, then they were colonies, in Asia and Africa. South America, Latin America, it was already, decolonized, but not Asia and Africa. So in these two parts of the world, in these two continents, the partitions of the colonies and the somewhat artificial and arbitrary redrawing of boundaries were accompanying the process of decolonization, as I mentioned a little while ago, and leading to large-scale displacement of population and riots and massacres. The European colonizers of these areas, they had started to demarcate, if we remember, the borders of their respective colonies to distinguish their own zones of control and influence, because there were competing colonial powers, and therefore there was a necessity to distinguish one's own zone of influence and control. And this period of colonial period began the demarcation between the inside and outside of a colonial territory. The post-colonial societies of the global South largely therefore inherited the colonially demarcated and sometimes, as I said, arbitrarily partitioned territories, as in South Asia, and they also legitimized and reproduced the colonial boundaries. This quite often led to the fragmentation of the earlier economic and cultural networks in the ethnic communities, among the ethnic communities that used to inhabit these regions. And when decolonization took place, we find that the exclusionary impulses gained significant strength in a frame of state nation. I would prefer to call it state nation, underscored usually as nation state in South Asia as well as in the global South. Therefore, the spatially bounded parameters of belonging based on the ideas of nation state, which we have borrowed from the global North, from our colonial masters at one point of time, have virtually excluded more people from the nation in South Asia, or sometimes also in other parts of the global South, dooming them to a bare life of unfreedom and precarity. Now, decolonization of the Indian subcontinent, if we come back to this region again, also led to the partition in 1947, giving particularly rise to two separate states, India and Pakistan. As the British colonial rulers, they hastily left their colonies in South Asia, in this region. The colonial boundaries, as well as frontiers, which were earlier frontiers, became de facto boundaries of the post-colonial states in South Asia, following the principle of uti possidetis juris, which is a specific legal mechanism in international law that legitimized the colonial borders in post-colonial times. But drawing borders in South Asia posed cartographical and territorial challenges. Why? Particularly, it was so when the freshly demarcated lines on the maps only somewhat nebulously followed geographical and sometimes ethnic contours. Therefore, it also raised issues concerning relations between these new states and their citizens. The citizens who were subjects of colonies and now constitutionally turned into citizens. So this was a new issue, and citizenship even today, after 70, 75 years of decolonization, it still remains a contentious issue in this region. And this is evident. I will give you two examples. For paucity of time, we'll restrict ourselves to two examples. If time permits, I can also come to the third example. Now, these two examples will be from Bhutan as well as from Myanmar. So how this new citizenship acts in the post-colonial times that excluded certain communities, and how they changed the entire scenario in South Asia. And we can also, if time permits, we can come to the Citizenship Amendment Act of India in 2019 that has posed new problems, fresh problems in this region. But we shall come to that later. Now, these efforts, this citizenship, enacting new citizenship laws or amending these existing citizenship laws, these are part of the nation building process. Nation building process involving inclusion of certain communities, I would say, within the fold of the post-colonial state, and the simultaneous exclusion of the remaining communities from the same political space, same bounded space. In other words, in South Asia, the nation building process is to homogenize, or was to homogenize, we can say, plural society consisting of different religious and ethnic communities who were historically sharing the same territorial space, and which was being controlled by, would be controlled now in the post-colonial times, would be controlled by a monopolistic state power, and through the territorialization of the post-colonial space. So this territorialization of post-colonial space, as I argue, it is derived mainly from the colonial world, from the global north. The global south, therefore, is a product of the empire, conceived to express all forms of subordination now brought about by the capitalist world system and neoliberal economy. Now, once the new borders were drawn or redrawn, as the case may be, in this newly decolonized South Asia, major distinctions needed to be made at the borders between the citizens and foreigners, insiders and outsiders, and between those who would be allowed entry and those who would not be. Therefore, the new state nations started to close their borders. Within a decade, those borders were either did not exist, and even if they existed, they were not closed. They were open or very much porous border. Now, within a decade, we can see the new borders became inseparable from the concept of passport, the passport system, except only in case of borders between India and Bhutan, thanks to the India-Bhutan treaty, bilateral treaty of 1949, and between India and Nepal, thanks again to the India-Nepal bilateral treaty of 1950. Although both these treaties are again contentious and debatable. I'm not going into the treaties. Now, meanwhile, apart from this Nepal and Bhutan case studies, we find that meanwhile the communal riots following the partition caused the death of about 2 million innocent men, women, and refugees. The number was quite huge in those days. In a way, quite comparable with the European situation during or immediately after the Second World War. One of the largest mass migrations in the 20th century occurred between 1946. 1946 was the year when the city of Kolkata, then Calcutta, it witnessed communal tension and communal riot, and that was the beginning. And such riots, such kind of tensions continued till the mid-50s. Therefore, this kind of migration, mass migration, it occurred between, say, 1946 to 1957-58. And during this period, at least 15 million people were forced to flee from or in fear of the bloody communal riots and seek refuge across the newly demarcated international boundaries. So my homeland suddenly became an alien land due to the demarcation of boundary. Therefore, this newly demarcated international boundaries I am talking now, Until today, as we can say, borrowing the lines from Aisha Jalal, the renowned historian, that partition continues to influence how the peoples and states of post-colonial South Asia envisage their past, present, and future. And this is true, as I said, even after 75 years of independence or decolonization of the Indian subcontinent. Now, as I said, our two examples would be in South Asia, would be about the Bhutanese Lotsampa community who are of Nepali origin, and basically primarily they believed in Hinduism, and Myanmar's Rohingya who are primarily Muslims. And these two cases would represent major trends, I would argue, addressing how the inhabitants of South Asia they gradually and systematically have been dispossessed of their basic rights as human beings and have been expelled to a world of unfreedom and precarity. Now, let us take the case of the Lotsampa community in Bhutan. Now, the Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan was never colonized. So one can wonder that how this question of coloniality and decoloniality, post-coloniality, how it should be applicable to Bhutan, which was never colonized. But as we would see that it had a close brush with the British colonial powers when it signed the Treaty of Punakha. Punakha is a town in Bhutan, and that treaty was signed in 1910. And this treaty ensured that the British Indian administration would not in any way interfere in Bhutan's internal affairs as long as Bhutan was willing to accept the advice from the colonial powers regarding its external relations. That means foreign policy in those days. In the late 19th century, in this context, the Lotsampa, the people of Nepali origin, as I said, also primarily of Hindu background, religious belief, they settled in southern Bhutan. And this part of Bhutan, it was underdeveloped in those times, and underdeveloped part of Bhutan. But within 100 years, it was the late 19th century, and within the 100 years, by the late 1970s, the dominant Drukpa community, primarily of Buddhist origin in Bhutan, they became apprehensive about the growing influence of Lotsampa on Bhutan's cultural identity. Now, the Lotsampa were soon therefore identified as illegal immigrants, although they have been living, most of them, for about 100 years. And there were, the Lotsampa was considered to be an apparent threat to Bhutan's survival as a distinct political and cultural entity. This term, distinct political and cultural entity, this term was used by the Ministry of Home Affairs of the government of Bhutan in 1993. I just quoted from that document. Now, the government, Bhutan government's mistrust of Lotsampa minorities, it intensified, as I said, in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, when the government of Bhutan decided to adopt a policy of national cultural orientation. And therefore, it passed two new citizenship acts consecutively, one in 1977 and then again in 1985. And these two citizenship acts, particularly the 1985 Act, drastically altered the citizenship requirements in Bhutan. And having already viewed the Lotsampa as illegal immigrants, it is quite natural that the government of Bhutan refused to recognize the citizenship identity cards, which were issued, after the last census that took place by the government of Bhutan itself. Those citizenship identity provisional, of course, provisional citizenship identity cards were no more recognized by the government. Subsequently, what happens? A decree from the King of Bhutan in January 1989 introduced Driglam Namza. What is Driglam Namza? Driglam Namza is the traditional Drukpa code of values, etiquette, and dress, which would be the cornerstone of the Bhutanization policy of the government. So this introduced this Bhutanization policy, this decree relating to Driglam Namza in 1989, January 1989. And in February 1989, the very next month, the Nepali language was also excluded from the school curriculum. Subsequently, through violent repression and forcible eviction, pressure, the Bhutan government compelled at least 120,000 Lotsampa to leave the country in 1990. And they entered into India first and to reach Nepal, and they resettled themselves in makeshift refugee camps of Jhapa and Morang districts in eastern Nepal in the main, and sought temporary shelter in those camps. Now, that is a different story. How they, fared there, how Nepal accepted them. Of course, Nepal initially accepted them. And as the Lotsampa were excluded from the Bhutanese citizenship, they were also dispossessed of their lands. And the emptied agricultural lands, which they themselves developed, the Lotsampa developed, they were, subsequently handed over to the landless people from northern Bhutan, mainly the Drukpa and other communities. On the other hand, the Bhutan government, there were several negotiations. Sometimes, mostly it was bilateral between Bhutan and Nepal. And during these negotiations, the government of Bhutan argued that the Lotsampa, from the perspective of, they viewed the Lotsampa community mainly from the perspective of terrorism and criminality. And therefore, they argued that the problem of the people residing in the refugee camps of Nepal, in eastern Nepal, it is not a typical refugee situation. They just refuse to recognize the Lotsampa as refugees, but one of a highly complex nature, with its genesis in illegal immigration. So once again, the term illegal immigration comes back. And subsequently, just to brief you, that in around 2008, following several failed rounds of negotiations between the Bhutan government and Nepal government regarding repatriation, finally, the UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, they decided to end this ongoing situation by resettling the Bhutanese refugees in the United States and other countries, including Australia, Canada, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Norway in the main. And these were mainly the UNHCR registered Bhutanese refugees, not the other refugees. There are other, refugees from Nepal. And we also have to remember that after, 15 years, more than 15 years, 18 years almost, about 18 years in the refugee camps in Nepal. I mean, the donor countries who are helping these refugees in Nepali refugee camps, they stopped, supplying aid and economic assistance for these people. And therefore, the UNHCR decided to resettle them in the third countries, as we just mentioned. Let us take one more example of the Rohingya from Myanmar. Now, the UN has mentioned, it's not my saying, that this is one of the most severely persecuted minorities in the contemporary world. And these people, the Rohingya, they were once residents of the Arakan state. Now it is called the Rakhine state in Burma. Now it is called Myanmar. Now they were legally excluded. I'm using the term legally excluded from Burma. Then it was Burma, therefore I'm using the term Burma in 1982, when the nation's military junta enacted a new repressive citizenship law. It rendered the Rohingya practically stateless because they were robbed of, stripped of their, citizenship they didn't have, but at least they have been living there for centuries. And now it was decided that under the new Citizenship Act, they do not situate anywhere. In 1991 and 1992, for the first time, we find that about 250,000 Rohingya fled an intensified post-election clampdown in the Rakhine state by the government, marking the first exodus of the Rohingya from Myanmar. Since then, the Rohingya have been victims of extrajudicial killings, burning of homes, massive and systematic sexual violence against women, and also mass killing of children. The subsequent large-scale persecution of the Rohingya led to further exodus, primarily into neighboring Bangladesh, but also in smaller groups to Malaysia and Thailand and other countries. But then it came, a turning point came, and it was on August 25th of August 2017. After a massacre, which was a humanitarian disaster, when hundreds and thousands of innocent Rohingya men, women, and children, they had to flee mass atrocities. Then we find that at least 730,000 Rohingya, they sought refuge in makeshift and already overpopulated refugee camps near Cox's Bazar in the southernmost part of Bangladesh, where the concentration of Rohingya refugees is considered to be one of the densest in the world, if we consider the camps. In fact, Myanmar's complete non-recognition of the Rohingya as legitimate citizens makes the future of more than 1 million refugees, and not only refugees, as I said, that they are now stateless. The stateless Rohingyas, their future, it is uncertain, ambiguous, and insecure. And then we had the military coup d'etat in Myanmar in February 2021. Following that, it is quite unlikely that these people would be, in the near future, they would be able to return to their homeland in Myanmar, in the Arakan state or today's Rakhine state, and therefore their prolonged situation of precarity and unfreedom is likely to create, as my friend Martin Lindner would argue, it would create an intractable Palestine-like scenario, Palestine-style scenario in South Asia. Now we come to, as we don't have much time, let us come to, from these two examples, let us look at the inadequacies of the post-colonial approaches. I am putting post within brackets in the sense that what was colonial is post-colonial in a sense. Now, the newly decolonized and economically poorer countries in the global south, they had to carry the burden of supporting huge refugee populations. If we look at the example of South Asia, we see that the partition refugees, this burden had to be, borne by both India and Pakistan, the two new states in this region, and who didn't have any say, hardly any say, beyond accepting the legal obligation to do so. The global south countries, and this is not true only in case of India and Pakistan, this was also true, this has been true for many countries in the global south, in Asia and Africa. And the global south countries, therefore, just like their counterparts in the global north, they are legally obligated to refrain from expelling refugees. We are aware of the principle of non-refoulement in the 1951 convention and in other documents of the international legal ecosystem on refugees. So we find that the prerogative, but this principle of non-refoulement is on the one hand, on the one side, and on the other hand, we have the prerogative of these newly decolonized states in controlling the entry and stay of non-national in their territory. And this has been inherent in the sovereign expression of power over national boundaries or borders. Now, migration, including forced migration, we find remains a legitimate area, as I said, of sovereign regulation and governance for the post-colonial states in South Asia, not only in the post-colonial states, but we find that this has been true also in case of the global north countries, where policies in South Asia mainly are primarily, these policies are calibrated according to the respective political goals and imperatives, and where sovereignty has precedence over the entry and residence of non-nationals. Although international human rights and humanitarian laws restrict a state's powers to socially and economically exclude or deport, as I say, a migrant or a refugee who resides legally in its territory or who is in distress and therefore seek shelter. International law also limits the sovereignty of states, as I said, to regulate entry through the principle of non-refoulement. But in South Asia, The post-colonial state has the final say. There are several instances and about the entry, resident, or deportation of a person arriving at the border or sneaking through it illegally. The South Asian countries are already obsessed with their newly acquired sovereignty after decolonization and distraught by the nuanced impact of partition. And therefore, I believe that they started tweaking their citizenship laws in a larger context of populist politics, thereby, in a way, exacerbating the ethnic fissures and eventually generating more refugees and stateless people. In this scenario, the so-called universal principles and laws, I understand, fail to address the pluralities and complexities of post-colonial South Asia and the global South in general, thus creating more ethnic fault lines and widening the existing ones. My next argument would be, or question would be, that, to examine the global, the term global in global compacts. We know that on September 19, 2016, the UN General Assembly adopted the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants and also sent a powerful, very powerful political message that refugees and migrants had become major issues in the global agenda, in global politics. The UN member states also recognized the need for a comprehensive approach and enhanced cooperation regarding human mobility at the global level. But this approach once again reiterated, we find the hierarchic treatment of refugees, asylum seekers, stateless people, and migrants by making, first of all, two global compacts in 2018. One for the refugees, Global Compact on Refugees, GCR, and one for the migrants, GCM, Global Compact for Migrants, thus ignoring the inseparability of these two categories. Because in these neoliberal times, we have been witnessing the mixed and massive flow of people across the globe. We must remember that. Anyway, the global compacts have been drafted, if I may say, mainly in the context of the refugee and migrant crisis in the global north once again, thereby neglecting the concerns in the global south and again, exacerbating, enhancing the problems created by the colonial regimes in South Asia and elsewhere. Because these two global compacts mainly emerged in the context of the Mediterranean crisis in 2015, when many people, many refugees, many migrants together, they have been trying to cross the Mediterranean to reach the shores of Europe, either for their livelihood or for their own lives, whichever it is. Now, just like the pathetic death of the Syrian Kurdish toddler Aylan Kurdi, who was drowned in the Mediterranean Sea while trying to cross it, many Rohingya refugee children, they also succumbed to death while trying to cross the rough stretches of the Bay of Bengal in leaky boats to reach the shores of other South and Southeast Asian countries. But that was not taken into consideration. The Rohingya refugees were only, hogged the limelight for a few days and then it subsided. Now, taking a cue from the Kolkata Declaration 2018, which was adopted at a conference organized by the Calcutta Research Group, CRG, on the status of global protection system for refugees and migrants in November 2018, we can perhaps question that how global these global compacts are. If they fail to acknowledge different practices of protection at various regional, national, local, customary, city, and other scales. Any global compact, I would argue, aiming at global governance. Now we are talking about global governance of migration and forced migration. That kind of global compact needs to be based on wide-ranging dialogues involving refugees, migrants, stateless persons, and groups defending them. And I think also more dialogues among the countries of the global north and the global south. Now, through a dichotomous construction of forced versus voluntary migration, which is very common, there has been a reification of purely legalistic distinctions between refugees and migrants. Now, such binary categories, in fact, privilege, in my understanding, the role of the state and speak more to its administering and management of borders rather than to the real experiences and horrible experiences of the migrants and refugees themselves. So instead of understanding or comprehending the reality of the migratory journeys or the journeys of the displaced, arbitrary distinctions between forced and voluntary migration that erect an unnecessary hierarchy of misery, serving as justification sometimes or the denial and receipt of aid by the people on the move. Now, to overcome these existing inadequacies and to address the complex issues generated by the overlapping of refugees, migrants, stateless people, asylum seekers, we now perhaps need to look beyond international refugee law per se, because there are also international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The then colonial powers in Europe were mainly involved in formulating the 1951 convention, as I said, and the modern refugee doctrine, while countries in Asia and Africa were excluded as they were not decolonized from the process of international law making. Now, my final section of my lecture. Is there a need for a decolonial thinking now? Now, as this neoliberal world now witnesses massive numbers of people on the move, as I said, it is very difficult to, distinguish between refugees and asylum seekers and migrants, economic migrants. And there has also been growing securitization of the refugees and migrants since 9/11 and other, terrorist attacks. And this has clearly pushed humanitarian concerns over the years more to the back burner. In a world beset by more, in the recent times, by the populist ideas of ultranationalism, xenophobia, and other things. With the migrants, refugees, and stateless people, as we see in different geographies and different histories, perhaps we need to look at these people, their experiences from a pluriversal perspective that may take into account different legal geographies and anthropologies of accommodation. Because we need to learn from each other about the best practices from the global north, best practices from the countries in global south. Now, in this context, the recent decolonial thinking which is more inspired by the indigenous movements in the global south, particularly in Latin America, may illuminate our pathways. Now, colonialism is a set of ideological, institutional, and epistemological practices that suppress the flourishing of life by limiting, obstructing, and disfiguring what we are capable of imagining and believing. Therefore, colonization doesn't end with the territorial decolonization. In fact, a narrative that reproduces colonial ideas of border, boundaries, and nation state identifies in terms of enunciation and lack reflexive criticality. A decolonial approach, on the other hand, is committed to the emancipation of human diversities in all its expressions and manifestations, and promises to create a new alternative world. The pluriversal approaches claim to recognize and appreciate, I would say, other cultures and other legal instruments, other kinds of, practices of accommodating people, accommodating so-called outsiders. And this can be understood if we try to engage other knowledges, other histories, and other experiences. The existing international regimes of migration, legal regimes of migration and refugees, operate on logic of constraint of sovereignty. We cannot deny that. And that fails to emancipate the refugees and migrants from the positions of inhuman exclusion. I'm putting in within brackets. In contrast, the truly global and not international, as we used to know, the truly global legal framework cannot and should not be trapped within the traditional Euro-American framework. We therefore can attempt to construct new and alternative spaces of decolonial knowledge on forced migration by using the non-European scholarship as the legitimating basis in equal participation and conversation with Euro-American scholarship. Therefore, as I said, there should be more dialogues, more engagements between the global north and the global south in this regard. Now, finally, while creating these emancipatory international and global, more global and universal frameworks, we should consider the geographies of reason and geographies of law. And therefore, I would like to conclude with a couple of interrelated questions for this evening's audience or today's audience. First, how can we address the concerns of the global south with regard to refugees, with regard to forced migration, in a global framework of governance of migration and refugees? The existing global framework and on migration and refugees. Number two, how far the empire of refugee law, I'm using the term empire of refugee law, can be negotiated with the notions of the existing international legal ecosystem without having a critical conversation with the decolonial. I'll stop here. I once again thank all of you for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabyasachi, for this wonderful talk, and which is very timely also, not only in terms of that the attempts for the decolonization of the knowledge production in then the institutions, but also where the refugees and the forced migrants, displaced people are very much high up on the agendas, and where discussions in various different geographies of discussions operate with, sometimes with geographies of amnesias and so disregard. So I think it is very very important and timely, the kind of the issues that you bring up and underline. I know that there will be, and then already there are some questions coming, but I would like you to push you or ask a little bit further, because what I hear from what you are saying is that in a way what you are talking about the colonial lineages in the nation states, that what you are referring at, and how those lineages that we see in the tensions of citizenship, and where you actually show that the exclusionary, that the citizenship of course includes, but its exclusionary moments, and how citizenship and refugee laws actually act as technologies of exclusion and dispossession, and various variegated dispossessions, legal dispossessions, but also which has several aspects. And I think this is what you show has much more broader relevance of the colonial histories of particular geographies. What you are showing is that, is it really only in relation to global south that we have to take these into account? So aren't we seeing, don't we see these these kind of the workings of those laws and technologies and those lineages in the nation states as inherent in the nation states, so that they are part of similarly resulting similar kinds of variegated legal fragmentations, geographies in the name of various categories: citizens, asylum seekers, aliens, foreigners, and the migrants. So my question is that you showed us very well in terms of how the dynamics unfolded in particular cases. But what could we draw more theoretically from this? Actually, it is not simply learning. I mean, it's not simply constrained to particular geographies and histories, but actually this has a relevance more globally, if we are going to talk about a global. So I would like you to say a couple of words in terms of going beyond that distinction between global South and North in relation to empires, nation states. And I think there is another question coming off, that the state nation that without coming. I know that some use also empire states, that the categories. So I will start with this question.
So do you expect me to respond now, or shall I collect a couple of questions more? You are muted, Aisha.
However you wish, but we could take at least, I think, maybe the question about that with the state nation and nation state, that because also it might go into it, because it is about actually the genealogies in the nation state. So there is a question from Debabrata Sen, and sir, you mentioned state nation instead of the nation state. Do you think is the concept of nation still necessary in the 21st century globalized world, though the oscillated world again moved towards a pre-World War II like situation? Is it possible to think of any other alternative to the concept of the nation? It goes a little bit a different direction than what I was posing, but maybe you could take them together.
Okay, let me now come. First of all, I agree with you, Aisha, that this is not really limited to this kind of genealogy of the nation state, which is primarily responsible for this kind of exclusion of non-citizens, of aliens, of foreigners from the political space, the territory of a state. It is true. And we know that, why I mentioned Westphalia, because, I mean, that really was a watershed when the territorial state emerged, when the modern concept of sovereignty emerged, and subsequently we know that mainly in Western Europe, the concept of modern nation state emerged. Rightly, wrongly, but that was the beginning. Now, if we look at the global South, I highlighted global South and particularly, the instances from South Asia, because when we look at the situation in the global South, we have a tendency, and in South Asia, we know that none of these countries in South Asia, particularly the members of the SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, none of them have ratified the 1951 Convention or 1967 Protocol on refugees. But many of the countries also became members of the Executive Committee of the UNHCR. And the basic argument on behalf of India, quite rightly, was that we have been receiving refugees and there was hardly any problem. And we have been refugees since the inception of our new state after decolonization due to partition. And millions of refugees, not only between 1946 and 1957-58, but also during the liberation war of Bangladesh around 1970-71, again millions of refugees, they poured into India and we accommodated them. Some of them went back to newly created Bangladesh and some of them didn't. But the fact remains that we always were concerned about the refugees. Therefore, there is no point of emphasizing that you should sign this document. So entire debate on refugee regime in South Asia has been, centered it centered around this signing, ratifying or not ratifying the 51 Convention, 67 Protocol, and so on and so forth. The fact remains that due to this non-ratification, kind of approval in a way, it also led to hierarchization of refugees within South Asia. So even in India, some groups of refugees were, they were accepted with open arms, and they have gradually they almost become a member of the Indian state, like the Tibetan refugees, and others, sometimes the Chakmas, sometimes the Tamil refugees from Sri Lanka, they were not treated in a similar manner. And now when the Rohingya stateless people or refugees, about 40,000 odd people, they are still in India, the Indian government would prefer to call them the illegal immigrants, and they would prefer to apply the Foreigners Act. So to cut a long story short, my argument is that these genealogies of modern nation state, the problem remains there. I agree with you, Aisha. And therefore, it is not restricted to the global south. But the situation in global north, the trajectories of problems, the trajectories with regard to the refugee framework, it took a different route. For instance, apart from Western Europe, the European Union countries, as you know, that there have been European conventions. We find that also for Africa, we have the African Charter. For South America, we have the Cartagena Declaration. So there have been regional frameworks. Why I emphasize South Asia? One is that I am slightly familiar with this region as a student of politics and student of migration studies. On the other hand, this region could not really formulate any kind of regional framework. And then if we have regional framework in different regions to deal with the refugees and migrants, no problem. But the situation would be one day that there would be variations within the framework, and a kind of global framework, which would be ideal, would be difficult to evolve from these regional frameworks, because it is the other way around. The global framework dictates the terms for the regional frameworks in the main. I'm not saying exclusive. So these technologies of exclusion, these processes of exclusion, these are inherent in the modern nation state, and which are common in a way in the global north and global south. And when the modern nation states emerged in Western Europe, the situation was different, because these states were more or less homogeneous. Now with the migration from the global south, the situation is changing. And therefore we find almost every day that these so-called nation states, they are being challenged, they are being pushed further by these new migrations from the global south, when different kinds of people belonging to different religious belief, different race, different color, different language, different cultures, they are migrating to these countries. On the other hand, the second question of Devobruto, which was there about state nation, that is mainly because in case of Europe, the nation came first, rightly, wrongly, I'm not going into that debate. Nation came first, and state became the political expression of those nations. In case of South Asia, in case of the global south, the state came first, because there was transfer of power, or there was some kind of a revolution, and therefore the colonial powers, the colonial rulers, they simply transferred the power. And therefore the state, that entity of state came first. And then the state decided, the leaders of the state, they decided, the powers that be, they decided that we should go for a nation building process. Why nation building process? Where the majority community would be the dominant, and they would call the shots. So minorities may be there, but they have to accommodate within the framework of that kind of which they would prefer to call nation state, but I would prefer to call state nation, as the state came first. I think I will stop here, and let us take more questions, and we can have more discussions.
Yes, thank you very much, Sabyasachi. I will just add one thing is that's actually Europe being that, I mean, homogeneous. I think that is Europe had never been. been homogeneous. The nation states had never been homogeneous. And I think what you're saying has a very big relevance, especially if you look at the Eastern Europe, at the Balkans, and then where the borders kept moving without the people moving anywhere. And then creating very different rights regimes. And then I think that the international laws that you were showing very well, how the international laws produce those kind of exclusionary results and actually rightlessness, and or a kind of the spectrum of rights which very easily leads to rightlessness, is very relevant in the global north too. But you're right that the details, the mechanisms, and then the actors might have been different. We have, I will take 3 questions. Soham Atikari, that was a lovely talk, sir. I was wondering how we can increase the visibility of the Lotsompa crisis within public consciousness. There are neither physical sites of memory nor an abundance of non-academic works. Would demarcation of refugee heritage sites by UNESCO and the like increase the visibility of these communities and their crisis? That is, again, that the uneven geographies of the visibility and presence, I think, of the groups. And I will read the other one too, from Raj Bardui. Thank you for this inspiring talk. As you know, the International Migration Review Forum will take place next month to assess progress made in the implementation of the Global Compact for migration. What sorts of leverage does the Global South have in negotiating the sort of a greater dialogue between the Global South and the Global North that you mentioned in your talk? And there's a continuation of that. People have been on the move from time imperial. Is classification of the people on the move in various categorization, in your view, is the classical way of the divide and rule, and making some more deserving than others? So you could start from whichever question you want.
Thank you, Aisha, once again. And I would say that first about the Lotsampa community. You see, today's moderator, Aisha, rightly pointed out about geographies of amnesia. And therefore, we have witnessed the Holocaust museums and memorials in different parts of Europe to remind us of the atrocities of the Jewish community and other people in Europe during Hitler's time or prior to the Second World War. We know that. But, you know, this museumization or memorialization of certain incidents, it may, you know, lead to some kind of interest of the future community, future generations, and they sometimes look back, in which became really footnotes in the history books. But at the same time, this kind of hierarchization of memories also, that also, you know, tells something, in the sense that some certain things, certain instances are remembered, while certain things are better to be forgotten. And it depends where we are located and how big is the community. Both things are important. So when, for instance, I was talking about this debate between universal and pluriversal, in a way, you know, the application of these laws, application of these principles, from that perspective, it could be universal. Because, you know, those could be applied, or those should be applied, because this, you know, doctrine tells us about an ideal. So that could be applied universally across the globe without any distinction made between race, religion, gender, or whatever it is. That is one part. But other part is that, you know, whether you are also taking into consideration the experiences, the histories and geographies, the laws of different parts of the world, different geographies. So that has not been taken into account. So definitely, you know, one can definitely take initiative about this kind of, remembering their kind of rightlessness, as Aisha mentioned, at a certain period of time. And when they were resettled in the third countries, the families were divided and they had to suffer this. So that can be remembered, but it won't go, I am afraid, perhaps, beyond a certain point to change the entire empire of international legal framework on refugees and migrants. That brings me to Rad's two questions. One is that, yes, the next month, the International Migration Review Forum, they would once again, assess the progress made about the implementation of the Global Compact on Migrants. Fine. But here, I would argue that first of all, we would argue, many countries would argue that 2 years were lost due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that led to different kinds of new crises, not only economic, but socio-cultural and otherwise. So that is one thing, and much progress could not be done. It was in 2018, now it is 2020, early 2022. Second is that now the Ukrainian war, that is likely to, attract our attention more globally, and particularly of the European countries. And there is also another kind of hierarchization we witness, that definitely many of the European countries, EU countries, they are ready to accept or already have accepted huge number of refugees. Already 40 million Ukrainians have become refugees, more than 40 million, apart from the internally displaced persons. And most of them have been accommodated in Poland, more than half of them. But would that be true in case of the Syrian refugees? Would that apply in case of the Afghan refugees? Would that be applicable for the Rohingya refugees? No. Unfortunately, the answer is in the negative. So when we talk about this kind of assessment, this kind of stock taking, the point is that the leverage of the global south, what kind of leverage does it have? Only, because the global south countries, as I said, they're trying to imitate, follow mostly the genealogies of the modern nation state that has been derived from the global north. And therefore, there is a policy of imitation, there is a policy of replicating. And why should the countries of the global south? This is not about the countries of the global south. Here, the states are only negotiating mostly. But what about the people's groups, the civil rights groups, global civil society organizations, their representation, where they can highlight the situation in the global south? That only can bring in these issues I was talking about. It cannot be, raised by the states, the state representatives of the global south, who would in a way like to, replicate, imitate the experiences of the global north. Because we all remember that how the global north countries in the global north, they have been trying to outsource the refugees and migrants or keep them at bay in some other small islands, some other countries. So why not for us also in the global south? Therefore, it is unlikely that this would happen. Yes, people have been on the move from the time immemorial, yes, but classification of the people on the move in various categories, it is not only a divide and rule policy. This kind of legalistic definition, this kind of distinction being made, where people would be more, obsessed with these nitty-gritties. Are you a refugee? Are you a migrant, economic migrant? So if you are an economic migrant, you are not entitled to certain rights. And if you are a refugee, yes, your case is slightly better. So these kinds of different kinds of claims and claim making, and also the recognition of these claims, competing claims, you can really problematize that through these ways. So that is another issue. And therefore, these categorizations only obfuscate the main issues of inhuman exclusion of refugees and migrants. Thank you, Aisha.
Thank you very much, Sabyasachi. That we have some other questions coming, but I will just underline one kind of in terms of there is no way to compare the sufferings of people. I think every suffering is too many. And then there's no way to compare them. But I would just like to draw attention in terms of how those categorizations and those legal encasements produce what kind of consequences. I have seen actually like 2-3 days ago that how the students from Ukraine who fled are anchored in very different protection regimes depending on whether they're third country nationals or Ukrainian students. I mean, they are fleeing the same war, and they are students, and this is institutionally and legally they are, and bureaucratically, in a very different protection regimes. And actually, maybe I think it is more that it's not that maybe the divide and rule, but deservingness gets into the picture, and the narratives of deservingness maybe gets into it very clearly. But let's take the other questions. Rajavir Basu, thank you for the illuminating talk. Do you think that the discussion on governance of forced migration in South Asia, the need for a decolonial approach, its horizon can be broadened by linking migration with sovereignty and the rule of law in global times? Also, sovereignty can be understood from David Helt's concept of cosmopolitan sovereignty, which is not tightly packed, but rather composed of fluid identities. I will take another one too, so that you choose, and then Nasrin Chaudhury would like to pose a question. Then she would. And then there's the other question, Sukatana Powell. Thank you for your talk, sir. How far the decolonial approach and North-South collaborative governance will help the refugee communities to overcome the anxiety of incompleteness? So you're free to respond one by one, combine, or pick the points from them, and then we will go to Nasrin's question. Maybe Nasrin, you would like to write your question, or you want to pose yourself, depends. Okay, Sabyasachi, maybe you just take these two ones, and then we will go to Nasrin's, either in the chat or her posing the question.
Okay, thank you, Aisha, once again. And when we talk about the governance of migration and refugees, particularly refugees, forced migration, definitely we cannot escape the question of sovereignty, as I mentioned, because sovereignty gives a particular state exclusive control over its territory, its population, and resources. But in these neoliberal times, the resources and other issues have been deregulated. And therefore, the capital, the technology, they are on move. There is no barrier as such, and sovereignty has been modified. In the European Union itself, we find the concept of shared sovereignty. Therefore, there is no exclusive control. Earlier, sovereignty was considered to be indivisible. So all these things have changed. But when it comes to the movement of people, it has not changed. Rather, there has been a re-territorialization. And therefore, we find higher international borders, more barbed wire between different countries to neighboring countries to restrict the movement of the people. Because the people are carriers of different cultures, and unknown alien cultures are not acceptable in a world which is obsessed with xenophobia, which is not comfortable with other kinds of people who speak a different language, who profess a different religion, religious belief, who eat different kinds of food. We are uncomfortable. So, in such a situation, uh, this kind of debate concerning sovereignty in the near future, it seems to be a non-issue because many scholars have already written about, extensively written about, the post-national world, post-national state, and many kinds of post-national governance, many things. But this has not been able to be, we could not translate them in reality. So when I'm not talking about David Hill per se, but the question is this cosmopolitan sovereignty. He has not developed the idea quite in detail, but this cosmopolitan sovereignty is still an ideal, and that cannot be translated into reality when we are still, we in a way in this neoliberal world, we are living in a post-Westphalian order, but our mindset is fixed in the Westphalian system of sovereignty and territoriality. So far, the movement of people is concerned. Now, about the second question, very briefly about Suchetana's question, that the problem is that there is, I never talked about any kind of North-South collaborative governance. I have said that there should be more dialogues. There should be more exchanges of views and experiences, exchanges of legal practices, which are necessary for preparing, framing some kind of a global compact or global law, global legal structure. That may help us because law itself, does it solve anything? Because even after having a law, many people in this world, they don't obey those laws. So apart from laws, our mindset also has to be changed, has to be modified. So laws are necessary. That may be a very good beginning, and for making that law, for making that law acceptable to different parts of the world, this pluriversal approach, this kind of a dialogic discourse between the global north and global south, not only involving the states, as I said, but also involving different communities, different representatives of different civil society, global civil society, national civil society organizations, that would be required. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sabyasachi. I will give the floor then to Nasreen Chaudhury to pose her question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. And thank you so much, Professor Chaudhury. This is actually indeed a very illuminating talk. I just had a small question because when we talk about uniqueness of South Asia, what exactly do we emphasize in this uniqueness in South Asian context? Is it just the absence of law, as you were saying, and there's a necessity to have a kind of an exchange at the same time? So I'm kind of torn between this idea of why do we emphasize decolonial and not post-colonial? So that's one basic fundamental issue that I always face, that we seem to be more comfortable in a normative domain of decolonial rather than saying it's post-colonial. So indeed, if we're talking about exchange, so we're obviously not equal partners for that exchange. So that's one aspect. The second is, as we speak, the Sri Lankan Tamils have, there are 4 or 5 families of Sri Lankan Tamils have entered Tamil Nadu, India, not as conflict-driven refugees, but refugees who have been driven by hunger. So in the domain of normative assumption, where countries which are not signatories yet take refugees, there's an opportunity to perhaps redefine the definition of refugee. So I'm kind of curious why is it that the post-colonial societies are not taking that, let's say, the jump in reconfiguring the idea of rights or the various domains of, let's say, alien, refugees, non-citizen, denizen, all of it together. So I was just curious if you could, kind of bring your expertise to this to, link your talk to the larger questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chaudhury. Yes, I'm coming to that. First, the distinction between why not post-colonial but decolonial. The point is that, as I argued very briefly, that the post-colonial narratives usually try to follow the colonial genealogies of modern nation states, the colonial technologies of exclusion. So decoloniality, in a way, it tries to delinks itself from the colonial technologies, and it is more emancipatory in nature. When we talk about the critical thinking, this emancipatory normative framework would be more important, and therefore decoloniality, in my understanding, would be more appropriate. Therefore, I have raised this question. That is not a concluding observation. I have only raised this question, and in my title of my lecture also, I have put the question mark. So this could be one alternative for an emancipatory framework where we could delink from the genealogies of the modern nation state involving sovereignty, territoriality in the traditional sense, and move beyond to a more humanitarian kind of treatment of the refugees, human and humanitarian treatment of refugees and migrants. So that is why I have used the term, I would prefer to use the term decolonial. Second, you are absolutely right. I agree with you that when this 1951 convention and the subsequent documents they were framed, that was a different context. And it was primarily in the context of the conflict-induced displacement. And that displacement concerning, the movement of people from one country to another, crossing the international boundary. So that was one situation. We didn't even consider the people, which we call, the victims of development-induced displacement or climate or natural disaster-induced displacement. So these categories, now we are talking about the climate refugees, but the climate refugees have not been taken into consideration in most of the international legal refugee framework yet. Debates are going on, different kinds of perspectives are coming, different scholars are raising these issues. Therefore, in future, when in this neoliberal world, we find that one country, for whatever reason, I'm not going into that, Sri Lanka is now facing a tremendous economic crisis, unprecedented in the recent past by any country in Asia for that matter. Now, people are fleeing that country out of hunger. It's not due to conflict, not due to development related issues, not related to climate disaster related issues like earthquake or flood or anything. So we need to take into account different kinds of situations, different kinds of developments. And this is probably one of the outcomes, if I may say, this Sri Lankan crisis is one of the outcomes of the neoliberal economy that we are having all over the world and also in South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabyasachi. I don't see any other questions, but I think we come to a point there that what one could not desire more from a talk, because actually your talk brought us to, and thanks to also the Nasrin's question at the end, the beginning of another conversation, I think, and tackling the question whether decoloniality has to be taken as normative or not, or I mean, if we are not going to use decoloniality not as normative, but as a particular form and pattern of power, which does not necessarily lies in the actual colonization or not, and then those the differences in terms of the added value of using decolonial or the post-colonial. I think these are the questions that face all of us. If we are going to talk about the global governance or the governance of refugees or the migrants, whatever that you would be calling them. And so I think your talk opened us another kind of a venue to follow those discussions. Thank you very much for not only for your talk, but also the very detailed engagement with the questions. And thank you very much for all your questions, which made this talk very engaging, very extending and enabling us to expand on the questions and the challenges that we are facing as scholars, as activists, as political beings. So thank you very much. And thank you very much again, Sabyasachi Chaudhury. And please keep following us. We will be having another talk on the 20th of April, which you will get all the details. Thank you very much. Have a nice day, evening, or afternoon. Bye.
Sure. Thank you, everyone.